We also learned who's trying this, who the jury is today. So let's bring in attorney Misty Marris, Florida prosecutor Dave Arenberg, and jury consultant Susan Constantine. I'll start with you, Susan. In terms of the jury, you got a split here, boy-girl, 6 and 6. You started with 17. They picked the 12 and the 5 alternates before they went in for deliberations. What stands out to you about the composition?
Well, it's very equally divided. So I think that they did a great job in selecting a very diverse group of people. Now, we know that primarily all of them are white, male or female, only one black or African-American person on the jury pool. Overall, when you look at the demographics of their background, the one thing that stood out to me was how many of them were gun owners, how many of them have, they had stated that how important it was for safety, that they had guns that were in their home, but they were always locked up, or their parents had taught them, to make sure that they're being safe. So that's one thing that really stood out to me. But overall, I think it was a very good, diverse jury pool. The one thing that stood out to me, we have a law enforcement officer. We also have a doctor who was on there that actually had 2 family members who died of gunshot wounds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, the race thing, it's certainly not representative of the percentage of the population, although it is a majority white area. But your points stand. Misty, 2 questions they asked. I'm much more intrigued, by the way, by the one, because there are 2 theories of the prosecution. Lay out what the 2 theories are that the prosecution put and what the questions were and why they're instructive.
Yeah, so Chris, some lawyers will say the most important part of a trial is openings or closings, but many will say it's the jury instructions. So here are the 2 theories by the prosecution. First, failure to perform a legal duty. This relates to a Michigan parental responsibility law. A parent has a legal duty to exercise reasonable care to control their minor child to prevent their child from intentionally harming another. That's how duty is established. Still requires foreseeability, still requires causation. Prosecution has to prove that she willfully neglected or refused to perform that duty. That's Jennifer Crumbly. Second theory, gross negligence, willful disregard for a known risk. Again, still requires foreseeability and still requires causation, but 2 different legal theories. So the first question out the gate, after just over about 2 hours of deliberation, was asking for clarification relating to these 2 legal theories and whether or not the jury had to determine that both were fulfilled. Judge clarifying only one theory has to be fulfilled, and the jury does not even have to agree on which theory it is, just that the prosecution proved one of those beyond a reasonable doubt. So this tells me
what's
the
so
jury's
interesting?
really grappling with those jury instructions and understanding what they mean.
Yeah, you know what's so interesting for all of us here? Those 2 questions are never pursued in prosecutions, okay? That's what makes this case so interesting. Maybe you have one other like it, but nobody ever gets tried to, any big charges against them for how a killer sourced a weapon. If you think about it, especially when it's in the same family, there's always been this prejudice that they've suffered enough. But gun storage is a big issue. As a gun owner, I mean, you take it very seriously. And in this case, apparently they didn't. So Arenberg, I think that is the lower fruit for the jury, is the duty to store and how he had access versus the duty of care of the parent, because it's still got to be reasonable. And do you think that entire jury, many of whom are parents, are going to think it's reasonable to tell a parent that you should be able to control what your teenager does?
It's interesting, Chris, because you've got a number of gun owners on the jury, and I think they're going to want some reasonable restriction on the gun, meaning to be locked away so that the kid doesn't have easy access, because these are responsible gun owners, as far as I know. But it's not just failure to lock away the gun, because Michigan law does not require, at least it didn't at the time, parents to lock away the gun. Now, the law has since been changed, but it does go to a lack of their duty of care. It does go to their gross negligence, because not only were they carefree on the gun, they're the ones who bought it for their kid who had mental issues, and they're the ones who knew about it and refused to tell the school officials about it when they were brought to the principal's office and had what I consider is the smoking gun, the drawing, where he was telling everyone what he was going to do, and his parents said nothing about it, didn't even take him home that day.
Susan is nodding her head. You believe that parents break how on this, who are on the jury?
Yeah, here's what's happening, right? We're living in a different world right now, and every time you turn on the TV set, you're hearing about another mass murder that's happening in a school. We're living in a different world, so we have to have different rules and put things in place. Right now, we're dealing with such a high mental health crisis, and these kids are not being cared for. They're just not being addressed properly in the schools and at home, et cetera. They're spending way too much time behind like their computers, and they're isolated. They don't have very many friends. A lot of them have some social identity issues. There's a lot of things that are happening here. But the thing is, what I want to bring out to you, Chris, I ran a report on his post. So everything that he wrote, when we talked about earlier about help, he needed help. He was crying out. And I took all of that information, I posted it into my program. 100% certainty he was going to commit a violent act. 100%. So when you see those letters, you see this. How much more information or evidence do you need? And I think that is also the parents' responsibility. I think it's also the school's responsibility. I don't think that necessarily it's all his fault either, because he was suffering a mental health issue, and it wasn't.
That's easy. That's easy. If you have a diagnosable and treated or untreated illness, I mean, the legal analysis we know has to be different. Look, I have reservations. I will reserve my reservations until we get a verdict here. But I'll tell you something else. Constantine, I got to do a story about all these different programs that you have. You're always like slipping something in that, we put it in the program. Turns out 88% he's lying and 100% chance he's good. I want to know what this software is that you do, and I want to introduce it to the audience. Dave Arenberg, Misty Marris, thank you very much. Susan Constantine, to be continued. Let's see if they get a verdict. Show of hands. Who thinks there's a verdict tomorrow? No one. Oh, there you go. Oh, now everyone. See how things change? All right, to be continued.